Welcome back to my nightmare. This is a total experiment in things I've never done before. But essentially, because I have refilmed this a couple of times, essentially what I'd like to do, since I've been house sitting so much, is start maybe like reading stories for you, because I was the person who liked to read out loud. It's no wonder that I became an actor. And since I haven't been home a lot lately, and I do miss making videos, but I haven't been sewing because I haven't been home. Between rehearsals for the show that is now over, which was an hour from my house, so I had to drive an hour there and an hour back to get to rehearsals. Plus, I house sat for like 4 different people this summer. I'm currently house sitting. This is not where I live. I just thought maybe it would be fun if we changed up a little bit. And to the person who said I talk too much in my intros, I'm about to talk a whole lot more. So basically, I have a friend who is in the theater group that I perform with a lot, who is kind of an AV person. I would have been his friend in high school. He hooked me up with a mic he recommended. I mean, he didn't buy it for me. I bought it. But he recommended this amazing mic and this little pop socket thing. So I just thought we could sit here. It's a beautiful afternoon. I've never done this before. And we could read my new story. So here's the thing. I'm going to do a quick sell on the story. It should last like 2 seconds and then we'll get to it. Basically, if you purchased my book this past spring, the deluxe edition of Carmilla 86, you had the story already. Hatchett Grannies is a bonus story. That's why it's the deluxe edition that you get in the back of this book. It's 3 chapters. It's a story about a band in the 1980s trying to make a really hard decision. Yes, it's a vampire story. It is set in the Quaint City After Dark series, which is where I've set Carmilla 86 and where I've set The Vampire and Mr. Claus. So you'll see some familiar faces if you've read those stories. So anyway, I thought since it's such a short story and it's about vampires and it's Halloween, which is my favorite time of the year, and I haven't done anything for Halloween this year because I've just been so tired, that we could maybe read this book together. Not the whole thing. I mean, eventually I do intend to read Carmilla 86 for you because I'm an actor. And now that we've finished a show, I need things to do where I'm playing a character. Okay. And if you're a sewer who follows me, please don't unfollow, because I love listening to audiobooks when I sew. And this could just be something cool for you to stream while you're working on your next project. And so the intention is we're going to start with Hatchett Grannies today. You don't need to have read any of the other books to understand what Hatchett Grannies is about. Okay, I promise. And it's more romance than spooky things. It's a romance between a vampire and a siren. I think you'll love it. So we're going to start with that. It's short. It's 3 chapters. But all of my books are short. Like, look at this. This is a tiny little book. So eventually, I think we could do Carmilla 86. Eventually, what I'd like to do, and when I say my books are short, this is 3 of them. This is 3 of my full-length novellas. So eventually what I want to do is do a podcast where I read the stories for a podcast. But I'm just experimenting right now. So I thought maybe we could do some story times where I read some of my books to you. I am going to try and cut out anything spicy because I don't want to be that kind of channel. So if I get to a part and I decide to skip it because it gets a little hot and bothered, you always have the option of buying the full novel or the ebook, currently on Amazon, but I am thinking about going wide, so it might be available on more platforms soon. And yes, we will do a whole video about that because I've got feelings, okay? But don't worry, I'm never going to stop sewing. Eventually I will get back to it. It's just I've literally not been home is the thing. And by the way, thanks for asking. The play was amazing, and I will never get over that experience. It was great. So without further ado, I'm going to spend 1 more minute reading to you some of the content warnings and the back stuff and dedication for Hatchett Grannies, and probably also Carmilla 86, because I do think it's important to warn you about those things. But if you don't care and you want to be surprised, please make sure you're taking care of yourself. I'm looking at myself, not the camera. Whoops. Please take care of yourself. Make sure you're doing okay. But I'm going to spend like a minute. But like there are some people who've helped me a lot with these books, and I think they deserve recognition for that effort. So And settle in. I've got coffee. I'm addicted to the Hershey's chocolate caramel creamer. Oh, so good. So I've got that. And let's get into it. Also, you should just go get Carmilla 86 because it's really good. Plus size vampire, okay? As I am recording this in a strange kitchen, there may be sounds like a lawnmower or dogs barking or something like that. I'm treating this video less as an audiobook and more as a we are just friends and I'm telling you a story. So pretend you're in my kitchen or my friend's kitchen, which is where I currently am, and let me read to you Hatchett Grannies by Avery Morstan. Hatchett Grannies is dedicated to my darling friend Jen, who has done a lot of beta work for me. I am forever grateful to you. Acknowledgement. This author would like to acknowledge the beta reading and light editing skills of Megan Gann, she, her. They would be lost without her. In addition to this, the author would also like to give thanks and acknowledgement to Dr. Jen Robinson and Allegra D'Ambruso for always listening and giving advice when needed. Content warning. Now, I did not include language because I never thought I was going to read this out loud to a person, but just so you know, there is a lot of cursing in my writing. As you can tell from my videos, there is a lot of cursing all the time, but there is language. Content warning. Carmilla 86 is a retelling of a classic lesbian vampire novel. This retelling is set in a small town in the 1980s. The characters have passing mentions of the following: the AIDS crisis, period-typical homophobia, homophobic language, racism, blood play, and critical observations of vampire stories. Hatchett Grannies, while shorter, follows similar themes. Please be safe and make sure you are comfortable reading a novel like this before continuing. Hatchett Grannies, a bonus Quaint City After Dark story. Chapter 1. Ooh, let's go on this side. Jane was running late. Fuck. Hold on. I need to start over. I already messed it up. Okay. Chapter 1, 1984. It's important that you know when it's this. Carmilla 86 is an 86. This is an 84. Okay, I'm done. Ready? Sorry, that was loud. I was gross. I'm sorry. Chapter 1, 1984. Jane was running late, but she had no choice. Her slouchy leather boots pressed harder on the gas as she rushed through the late evening traffic. Thankfully, the bar didn't open until 9, and the band wasn't going to start playing until 10, so she had a tiny bit of wiggle room, but she knew the other girls were going to be freaking out. It wasn't her fault that it was almost impossible to find a hairdresser who did house calls these days, and that, in order to get that specific shade of blood red that she'd wanted, they needed to overprocess her hair for about 15 minutes. She suffered for her beauty. Modern times were horrendous. She glanced down at her right hand where it held the wheel, noticing the faint pink burn from where her fingers had been too close to the door as she welcomed the new stylist into the shithole house she was renting with Annie. She'd had to pay extra and, well, good help was hard to find, even harder if you happened to snack on it a little bit. Fucking sun, fucking daytime, fucking hairdressers. As she parked along the dark street that the bar was located on, with the limited street lamps overhead, she managed to catch a glimpse of herself in the rearview mirror. Grinning, she finished sliding the beat-up old thing into a spot and angled the mirror to get a better look. Her hair had turned out perfect. It was big, it was bright, and it would shine under the stage lights. Satisfied, Jane lit a slim cigarette, put her mirror back, and blew out a puff of smoke. Better to get this shit show on the road, then. She exited her vehicle, cigarette dangling between her painted lips, and pulled her old leather jacket out of the back seat. For summer, there was still a bit of chill in the air. With her guitar case in one hand and keys in the other, she headed for the back door of the bar. The scuffing of her shoes was a satisfying sound as she approached Scotty. She grinned at him. "Hey, hot stuff," Jane said. She winked. "How's it hangin'?" "Quiet night so far," he signed back. Scotty was a mountain of a man who was born with partial hearing. Scotty was deaf, but he was pretty good at reading lips. When her hands were free, Jane could do some basic signs with him, and he seemed to appreciate the effort even though she knew she was rusty. "Think it'll stay that way?" "God, I hope not. That would be boring as fuck," Jane said. She held up her guitar and gave it a little wiggle. "I came ready to rock." Scotty rolled his eyes, but he let her pass as he enjoyed one final smoke break before the bar opened. Jane loved walking through the bar when it was closed. The energy was so addictive, she often wondered if she were part succubus. Tonight, she could smell the electric charge in the air. It wouldn't be any different. With all of them arguing over the big deal, it was likely to make for either the best show or the worst show. She exhaled and paused at the bar to put out the remainder of her cigarette in one of the heavy ashtrays that littered the wooden top. There were 2 bars, technically, with a big open space in the center. The tiny platform that Allison, the bar's owner, called a stage was behind a cage that could only be accessed through the stage door, which was behind the main bar. Allison waved to Jane from the other side of the room where she was making sure everything was stocked up for tonight. Jane tilted her chin up in a nod with her lips twisted in a greeting. She slipped behind the bar and headed for the stage door just as it opened. Frankie, who had a crate of clean glasses in her hand, came down the short set of steps from backstage. Jane beamed at her. "Frankie! First night?" Jane asked. "Yeah," Frankie said with a sigh as she hefted the crate up onto the wooden bar top. She wiped her forehead with the back of her hand. "Thanks for getting me the gig. Allison says it gets real busy. It'll help pass the time." Jane smiled and nodded. "Don't worry about it, as long as you remember to keep an eye on me tonight, like we talked about." "I'm here for you," Frankie promised. She winked. "Use me." "After," Jane teased with a grin. She blew Frankie a kiss, knowing that their flirtation wasn't going to go anywhere, and headed backstage towards the tiny dressing room all the musicians shared when they played this hole. The night was electric with possibilities, and Jane was going to eat every single one of them up. Annie was the only one in the dressing room. She was pacing back and forth, chewing on her acrylic nails. Jane frowned and closed the door behind her. She reached out, and Annie let her inspect her manicure. The blue tips, which were not super long because Annie played keyboard and they got in her way, were sparkly and covered in little airbrushed flowers. Only a few places had chipped. Jane lifted Annie's fingers to kiss over the tips. "It's going to be fine," Jane promised. Annie blushed and then tugged her hand away quickly. "I don't feel like it's going to be fine. I feel like it's going to be tense and uncomfortable," she said. Beneath the heavy blush she'd put on for stage, Jane could see the real heat spreading over Annie's skin as she flushed pink. They'd been friends for too long. Jane knew all of her moods. "It might be, but we've been in tense and uncomfortable situations before. Have I ever steered you wrong?" Jane asked. Annie's answering expression was doubtful. "Okay, don't answer that." The bulbs that surrounded the mirror gave off an intense amount of heat despite their gentle glow, and it made the worry in Annie's blood smell even more potent. Jane leaned in and inhaled along her delicate throat. It was impossible to miss Annie's oceanic scent. All sirens had it. The salt water of the sea clung to them like a jacket they couldn't take off. "You smell biteable," Jane teased. This close, she couldn't miss how Annie's pupils dilated or how her nostrils flared out. Jane's lips curved upwards. "Have you eaten today?" Annie asked nervously. Jane winked. "I could always make room for dessert," she offered. She licked her lips and watched as Annie's eyes tracked the movement. It was ruined when Jane had to laugh, unable to contain herself at the horrified look on Annie's face. She leaned back. Of course I ate, Annie. It's a gig night. I'm not going to risk all those bodies out there. Oh, yeah? What did you eat? Annie muttered. Jane shrugged. I'm just saying we might need to find a new hairdresser, she said. She stepped around Annie and leaned towards the mirror to dab at the corners of her mouth. Her lipstick needed a touch-up. Jesus, Jane, it took us a long time to find that one, Annie replied. Jane rolled her eyes. It's not my fault. She said some really nasty things anyway. I don't regret it, Jane said. Candy, the hairdresser, had not been kind about some of the news stories involving gay men, and it burned Jane from the inside out. She'd let her finish the new do, and then turned Candy into a missing persons ad. Hey, sharks gotta take a seal or two when they can, right? Did you think about the offer? Annie asked nervously. Jane's eyes glanced towards Annie in the mirror. Annie hovering behind her like a guardian angel. Annie, who didn't care about anything except for their safety. Jane nodded. My decision stands, Jane said with a shrug. Her jacket creaked with her movement. Dawn and Wallace are nice girls, okay? But a record deal would compromise our safety. You know I've been worried about cameras and pictures since the damn things were invented. We have to fly under the radar. I won't risk you. You care about them, Annie said softly. Jane nodded. She looked back at her own reflection, studying her face so she wouldn't have to see the concern in Annie's eyes. I care about us more, she replied. It's not worth it for two very nice humans who will be nothing but a memory in a few short decades. I love playing music. I love the audience, but I don't need to be an arena act. I'm happy with what we're doing. Playing cover songs in a dive bar was a strange way to make a living, but Jane loved to play, and she adored the attention they received. Wallace will be fine with whatever we choose, probably, Jane said quietly. She shrugged. Dawn is never going to change, Annie. We've seen it before. If I thought money could help her, I'd give her $100,000 tomorrow. I'd give her everything. We have time to make more. But her behavior, Annie agreed with a sigh. Yeah, Jane said. She twisted, letting her bum rest on the counter and the warmth of the bulbs heat her back. I wish there was something I could do, but we can't save everyone. Like you said, we've seen it all before, Annie said. Jane smirked. Wouldn't change it for the world, Jane said with a grin. Annie's face took on that stormy, conflicted expression again. Jane, she warned. I get it. Jane reached out to take Annie's hand again, swinging them gently. You told me 100 years ago that you're not into it. I just wish I knew why. We'd be so good together, and I know you're not straight. You do know why, Annie said insistently. I truly don't, Jane replied. She dropped Annie's hands and held up her own in surrender. But it's okay. No is a complete sentence, and I'm fine with that. Best friends, I just wanted to understand. If it's the vampirism, you heard my true voice, Annie said, in that adorable little wrinkle appearing between her knit brows. Don't make this harder on me than it has to be. If Jane didn't know better, she'd have thought time froze. For the brief second she had to process that sentence, she didn't hear any sound anywhere. Her jaw dropped. What? You heard me singing. You're under the spell, Annie said with a sigh. She shrugged. You know I can't. Hold on, when? I've never heard you sing, Jane told her. Annie rolled her eyes. The night we met. On the beach. I was singing before I fell down the hillside and banged my head? Jane asked. She still blushed at the memory. Literally falling head over heels for a beautiful girl sitting by the sea in the light of a mostly full moon. It had been, well, magical seemed like a cliche word, but if the glass slipper fit. So this is a consent thing, Jane said in a flat tone. You think I'm magically under your spell, and that's why I've stuck around since the 1770s. Annie nodded. There was a knock on the door and Frankie popped her head around. Hey, Jane, there's someone asking about you. Lark Dixon? Wish me luck, kiddo, Jane said to Annie. Annie leaned in and pressed a quick kiss to Jane's cheek. She stared into her eyes as she pulled back. Good luck, she whispered. Jane gulped. Round everyone up. We've got a gig to play, she managed. Coffee break. Chapter 2. Jane was pretty damn cool. She knew this as fact. She actually worked pretty hard at it. It was a challenge to stay on top of trends when they changed every few years, but you hadn't changed in 2 centuries. But as cool as Jane knew she was, she wanted to grow up and be as cool as Lark Dixon. Lark's smell hit Jane's nose the minute the stage door opened. She was standing at a high top, chill as could be, examining her nails as Jane came down the stairs and rounded the bar. Her white suit was immaculate, which was pretty intimidating in a place like this, where smoke seemed to linger in the air even when the bar was closed. Lark's smell was spicy and kind of sweet, and it burned Jane's undead lungs more than a little. It was unusual, but Lark wasn't the first person to set Jane's nose twitching. Hatchett, Lark said, lifting her eyes from her nails to smirk at Jane. Jane nodded. Dixon, she replied. She shrugged. The band has decided to decline your offer. The band has decided, or you have decided? The band, which is called Hatchett Grannies because of my last name and is a band I formed, says no. Jane tried to lean on the table, tried to keep her cool, but Lark made her feel uneasy. Lark tilted her head, and her shiny helmet bob shifted with the movement. Her eyes tightened around the edges as if Jane were a puzzle she were attempting to solve. There must be something I can offer you. It's a generous contract, I'll grant you, Jane said, but she shrugged. But we're not for sale. We play because we like to play, and we don't give a damn about the money. Lark's lips twitched. Your humanity, then. If Jane's blood hadn't already been below normal temperatures, she would have said it froze over. She bunched the tips of her fingers in her sleeves to keep them warm. My what? If money isn't enough, what if I offered you the chance at humanity again? Little heartbeat? Little bit of human hormones? Lark said with a casual shrug, as if she hadn't just blown Jane's biggest secret out into the open. If you were alive, maybe the little harpy spell would be broken. Maybe she would actually give you a chance if she could take you on a date during the daytime. Not when most of my dates occur, if you catch my drift, Jane said. She wanted to be sarcastic, but her words were too flat to manage it. She swallowed. How did you know? What? That you're a vampire, Lark said with a laugh. She shook her head. Her hair didn't move. Don't be stupid. It's obvious. All black? Check. Only works late at night? Check, check. The conceit of thinking you're the biggest, baddest thing out there? Please. You're a textbook case. Jane bit back a shiver. And other than the record contract, what exactly are you asking for? Didn't read the fine print, did we? Lark replied. A few seconds of... A few souls, a couple of decades of rock and roll. It's pretty standard. My soul, Jane clarified. Lark nodded. And that siren. And the 2 humans, she said. Fame, fortune, potential for a horrible, marketable death if your sales dip too low. You could be so much bigger than bar crowds. At the cost of their souls, Jane thought. Annie, Wallace, Dawn. A few decades of sunlight and possibly convincing Annie to go on that date. It's not worth it, Jane said quickly, even though she was blushing. Lark was grinning as if she'd said yes. We'll work out the details after the gig, she purred. As far as Jane knew, nothing could bring a vampire back from the dead. That was kind of the whole point. She shook her head and decided to head backstage. She needed to warn Annie. She needed to get her guitar ready. She needed to stop considering this stupid deal. Everything okay? Frankie asked as Jane passed her behind the bar. She was cleaning a glass with a soft rag. Jane paused. What do you know about demons? Jane asked, dropping her voice to a whisper. After all, she'd brought Frankie in specifically to watch out for them. This is what she was here for. Frankie lifted the glass and peered through it, with the bottom facing the table where Lark stood. She frowned. Jane wondered what she was looking at. I don't deal with the dark stuff if I can help it. Best to leave it alone. Jane's brows rose in surprise. No dark stuff. What am I then? Frankie dropped the glass and gave Jane a very disappointed look. Oh, please. Vampire is like the lowest ranked of fucked up there is. Okay. Jane would really need to think that one over. We murder people? So do most humans, Frankie replied. You think death is the worst thing you can do to someone? What the fuck? Well, thank you for this new and horrifying information, Jane said. Gonna go do my job now. You're welcome, Frankie sang as she walked away. Of course, Annie was waiting for Jane at the stage door, her hands wringing together nervously. Jane wanted to kiss that stupid, worried expression off her face. How'd it go? Did you say no? Kind of, Jane said with a shrug. She tried to push by, but Annie reached out and snagged her arm. What do you mean, kind of? She demanded. She made me a really good offer, Jane said. Come on, we have to get ready. The doors are open. I don't care, Annie hissed. What did she offer you? Don't ask, Jane replied. Annie scowled. I just did. My life, okay? Jane rolled her eyes and pulled her arm out of Annie's grasp. She offered me a chance to be human again. She offered me a heartbeat, Annie. How? Annie asked. Jane felt sorry for her. She looked as stunned as Jane felt. Don't. It's not pretty, Jane told her. Damning the souls of her friends? Selling out? No, it was an ugly deal. Look, we've got to get a move on. I was late to start with. But Jane, not right now, Jane insisted. Later. If Annie had been worried about Jane needing to suck someone down in between sets, she shouldn't have, because the scent of hairspray, cigarette smoke, and sweat had Jane feeling kind of nauseated. Coupled with the intense heat of the tiny stage lights above them and the dark, watchful stare of Lark from the audience, Jane's body felt ready to combust. She idly wondered if this is what other vampires felt like after stepping into the sun just before they died. There was something to be said for playing a show with so many distractions going on. Annie was so worried about Jane, she was meticulous in playing her keyboard so as not to screw up the rest of the band. Jane avoided looking at her. Wallace, who played drums, was keeping perfect time. She always did. Jane knew that, as much as Wallace enjoyed music, her true passion was her day job. She was a math teacher, and she loved teaching her students. When Lark approached the band with the initial record deal offer, Wallace had voted yes. The money sounded good to her, and why not? But she'd be okay without it. Dawn was the issue. Dawn, the bass player, and Wallace had no idea that Annie and Jane were anything other than human. They didn't understand how Jane would sacrifice everything to keep Annie's face from being photographed. Pictures were getting so common, and neither Jane nor Annie could handle the idea of tabloids and photo shoots. Being recognized. It would make it much harder for them to live. Annie and Jane had both said no to the initial deal, and Dawn had just puffed on the cigarette between her fingers and gave a joyless smile. It's a tie then, because I want the deal, Dawn had said. She knew that Jane intended to turn Lark down, and she glared daggers at her the entire night from across the stage. Jane almost stuck her tongue out at her in response, but she didn't feel like being juvenile. What Jane needed was to focus. This might be the last show Hatchett Grannies would ever play together. She needed tonight to rock and rock hard. But she couldn't help but thinking, what if, as she sang? What if she took Lark's deal? What if she said yes and gave away all their souls for fame and fortune? If there was one thing she was sure of, this whole immortality shtick wasn't actually forever. Something would get them eventually. If Jane picked Lark's deal, she'd just be getting ahead of the game, choosing her own fate, which is what she'd always done, right? Annie grabbed her after the set and tugged her into a shadowy corner. Don't do it. Whatever she's asking you, whatever she's promising you, just don't. It's not worth it. Jane pursed her lips. And my life? You have a life, Annie said. We have a life together. Jane took Annie's hand and placed it on her chest, where her heart would be beating if the thing still worked like it was supposed to. They were so close, like two planets that couldn't resist each other's magnetic orbit. A collision or something on the horizon. Oh, damn, that actually might be a good song lyric. We have a life together, but you won't kiss me. I want to, though, Annie said softly. She lowered her eyes, looking at where their hands rested on Jane's chest. If I knew it was you wanting it. Damn it, Jane, I don't want you to change. I like you just how you are, and if you took this deal and she changed you... There is no spell, Annie. I never heard you sing, Jane told her. She sighed and looked around to make sure they were alone. I fell down the hill onto the beach and knocked my head on a rock so hard I heard nothing but bells, okay? You don't sing when we play with the band, and the only other times we've had to use your voice for something, I've covered my ears. I like you. For real, like you. I couldn't live without you. So fucking sweet, Dawn's voice said, dripping with liquor and sarcasm. Jane cursed that woman to hell and back because Jane had been so wrapped up in Annie she hadn't seen or heard Dawn approach. The baby dyke finally admitted her feelings. The way she sneered over the word dyke made Jane's blood boil. She struggled to keep it in. Can I help you? You can start by accepting the record deal, Dawn said. She shrugged. Her sequin silver top glittered even in the shadows. You take the deal, and I won't rat you out to the whole world, vampire. Jane heard Annie's infinitesimal gasp, but she'd been playing these games too long to let someone like Dawn win. Don't you have some rodeo clown to be riding off into the sunset? I said we weren't taking the deal. Are you just going to ignore what I said? I know what you are, you twit, Dawn said. If you don't accept the deal, I'm sure you've got some brilliant plan like tell the tabloids or go on television. You're not the first person to threaten me like that, and you won't be the last, Jane snapped. She had turned to face Dawn and positioned herself to block Annie in case anything happened. You want to be a rock star? Go tell her you'll do it by yourself. Solo act. Dawn made a face. Her garish lips, painted a hot magenta, looked like a wound as they pointed downwards, like someone had just carved into Dawn's face. Her expression caused something to occur to Jane. That's it, isn't it? Jane said. She doesn't want you. She just wants us. Dawn's eyes flashed angrily. Bands are hot right now. No. You're useless to her, Jane said. She reached behind her to grip Annie's hand. You do whatever it is you're going to do, Dawn. Just remember, if you know what I am, then you know what I'm capable of. Jane pulled Annie out into the crowded bar and left Dawn to manage herself backstage. So, this would be the last time Hatchett Grannies was going to play with this lineup anyway. Maybe they'd take a decade or two off and come back as their own kids or something. Jane saw Lark waiting at that same high top, even though the bar was shadowy and that white suit was bright and beaming like a beacon calling to Jane. She squeezed Annie's hand. Look, we drove separately. I'll ask Allison if we can come get our instruments tomorrow. Go home and be careful, Jane said quickly. I don't want to give Dawn or whatever barstool fool she's shacked up with this week any chances to hurt us. I'll talk to Lark. Annie's free hand came up to grip Jane's chin. Her eyes bore into Jane's, conveying so much with just a look. She licked her lips. Don't change, Jane. Don't give in. We can take care of Dawn. I'm not worried about her, Jane said. She winked. Promise. Lark looked disappointed. She knew what Jane was going to say before she even got to the table. She angled her head, and together they walked towards the front door. It was too loud to talk inside, not to mention, as Dawn showed earlier, where there were people, there were eavesdroppers. As they left, Jane signed a quick "I'll be back" to Scotty. You offered me a breathing life, Jane said quietly. Her shoes were clicking on the concrete again as they headed away from the club. They paused under a street lamp, and Jane couldn't help but notice how subtly sinister the overhead light and the shadows it made caused Lark to look. Or had she seemed sinister the whole time? If you can give me a heartbeat, you could make Dawn and Wallace into something great. Why didn't you want them? You're not stupid, Lark said quietly. You're dumb as a box of rocks, but you're not stupid. Hey! Well, why didn't you help her? Lark countered. Jane shrugged and fluffed her hair with one hand. I've been around for a long time. I've seen girls like her. I mean, don't get me wrong, I've got a shitload of exes, and I'm never going to look down on someone for sleeping around a bit, Jane said. She shook her head. But there's something about Dawn and her self-destructiveness, and apparently how willing she is to sell out her bandmate for whatever appears to be a ride out of this town. She's unrepentant. She'll never change. If I give her money... To be frank, she reminded Jane of her own mother a little. Anytime Jane had a penny to herself, her mother had disappeared with it. The day Jane died had been the happiest of her life, if only to get away from that woman. Lark seemed to be considering what Jane was getting at. She nodded. If you had taken me up on the deal, I would have gotten 3 souls that I could use. We already have one. Do you want to guess which one that is? Makes sense, Jane whispered. Lark nodded again. If you ever change your mind, she said, raising one eyebrow. Jane shook her head. I won't. Lark snickered. You might. You've got time, after all. Jane watched her blend into the shadows without a single footstep sounding on the sidewalk as she left, and she wondered if there would ever be a time that she might change her mind. But for now, she had Annie waiting at home for her, and they had a lot of relationship exploring to do. And more than a little fucking, if Jane got her way. By tomorrow, Jane hoped Dawn would be in another state with a new guy. Maybe she could talk to Frankie before rolling out for the night. See if there was any kind of banishing trick the little witch could do. We're almost there. 38 minutes. About 20 more minutes, probably. Sorry, I need to stop clearing my throat on camera. Chapter 3. Present day. Jane felt fucking old, okay? The modern world was taking its toll on the vampire life. There was social media, digital presences, catfishing, and disaster after disaster. The most recent pandemic, and she'd lived through a couple before this one, okay, had left her feeling exhausted. Although, any excuse to hole up in a nice house with Annie for a few years was an okay time. But as much as Jane was technically already dead and Annie was still living, so there had been a whole heap of new worries on top of everything else, it had been rough. But they made it. And they were finally back to playing live gigs. They'd even had that cute couple get engaged at their Halloween show. If you know, you know. Jane studied her face and wondered if the exhaustion was showing in her features. She didn't get wrinkles, but she felt like she should have them. Her teased red hair was gone, and it was all flat and brown again. Still cut in a shag, though, since that seemed to be the queer style du jour. Heavy eyeliner, dark lipstick, going for an early aughts emo situation instead of a blondie thrown back. And Annie, her sweet Annie, who had always favored more natural looks, she'd hardly had to change a thing. Thank God the day of perms seemed to be over. There was a loud knock on the dressing room door, and it startled Jane out of her reverie. "Hey, you ready?" Frankie asked as she popped her head in the door. Her hair was now dyed a shocking blue, and it framed her ageless face perfectly. "Yo, you're not allowed to smoke in here." Jane rolled her eyes and picked up the cigarette from where she'd left it burning like incense in the ashtray next to her and stubbed it out. "It's not tobacco. I gave that up in 96. "You can't have weed. It's flowers," Jane replied. "It's a specific type of flower, actually." "Ew," Frankie said. She reached over and poked the cigarette with her finger. "What's it for?" "The aesthetic," Jane said. Frankie rolled her eyes. It was actually for her nerves. A tiny hint of a sedative, but Frankie didn't need to know that. "I'm just waiting for Annie to get out of the ladies' room." Yeah, the downside of having someone still biologically active is occasionally they have to do biological things, Frankie said. Jane frowned. She wasn't quite sure that was supposed to be worded like that, but hey, it was Frankie, and she hardly ever made sense. Frankie nudged her with her elbow. "You know, they're like giant complicated plants." "Yeah, I guess," Jane agreed with a nod. She looked back to the mirror. Did her eyeliner need a touch-up? "Feels a bit like old times, don't you think? Me in a bar, you playing a bar. Whatever happened to the old one, anyway? Allison's bar. I didn't last very long there." "Fire. Allison lost it," Jane said. She sighed. "It wasn't her fault. A fight broke out. Shit got rowdy. It happens." "Everything falls down eventually," Frankie agreed. "That's depressing," Annie said as she came out of the bathroom, wiping her hands on her jeans. She slid into Jane's open arms, like a puzzle fitting into a waiting slot. Perfect. That was embarrassing. I'm sorry. My stomach's growling. I didn't eat before this. Anyway. Jane rocked her back and forth, smelling that sweet salt smell that had never faded. "Hey, did you know that Dawn's kid is in the audience tonight?" Frankie's brow knit together in confusion. "Who?" "Dawn. You remember that girl who was real sketchy, threatening to expose me for being a vamp?" Jane said. She felt Annie's hug tighten. That was smooth of me. And she rubbed her back to soothe her. "Oh, the banishing spell," Frankie said. "That was so long ago. Any kid Dawn had now would be old, wouldn't they?" Annie said. "Early 40s, Jane confirmed. Annie pulled back, alarm on her face, and Jane kissed her cheek. "Hey, don't worry. I was careful. I smelled familiar blood, so I went looking for some information." "Which person is it?" Annie asked. "Shaggy hair, dark, kind of a butch. Use they, them pronouns," Jane said. Frankie's eyes widened. "Oh, that's Tate." "Yeah, Tate's home life sucks," Frankie said. Jane made a sucking noise against Annie's neck. "Not as much as I do," she said with a giggle. "Not right now. We've got a show to do," Annie laughed. Frankie was already groaning and heading for the door. "Behave, kids. You've got 10 to show time," Frankie said as she opened the door. Jane laughed. "Thank you, 10," she called out after. When the door closed behind Frankie, she met Annie's worried eyes with a sweet smile. "I promise. I was careful. They're just a fan of our music. They thought it was cool to meet me. It was very cute." "Okay, I just wanted to make sure you're safe," Annie told her. "I wouldn't risk us for the world," Jane said. "Hey, we have 10 minutes. You think that's enough time to—" Annie laughed. "Absolutely not." Jane grinned and gave a shrug. She turned back towards the mirror, deciding she did need to touch up her eyeliner. Can't blame a vamp for trying. Thank you for listening. That is the end of Hatchett Grannies. And hey, 45 minutes is not so bad to listen to a story. If you want to read Carmilla 86, I will either be reading that to you soon, or you can just go buy the book and support me, a little indie author. That'd be cool. I will try to remember to put a link to my Amazon wish list down below. Or not wish list. What is it called? My Amazon. You know what I mean. Anyway, if you like this video, please consider liking, commenting, subscribing. But more than that, if you like the story, consider reading the other ones or telling your friends. And remember, go outside, take a walk, eat a snack, take a nap, take care of yourself. You're the only you I have, and you're kind of a giant, complicated houseplant. And I don't have a green thumb. Get some rest, and I'll see you next time. Bye.